also be talking a little bit about standards and branding, building on some of the points that have been raised in earlier presentations, in this case specifically on Cashmere. So this is going to start off with the findings from our recent research project undertaken with UNESCO IISNC on basically Cashmere ethics and sustainability, and sort of how those can connect to something we might think of heuristically as nomadic culture, in quotation marks. I presented some of the findings from this research before in other settings that some of you might have heard, but I will start off with kind of a summary of the main findings from our project over the past 2 or 3 years, and then move into some of our key findings on culture and sustainability from our field interviews with nomadic herders. So to start off with branding, right? When we think of Cashmere as international consumers, we're most likely to think of luxurious, very soft scarves, sweaters, and other types of garments like this. This screenshot here is from an online shop taken very recently, which highlights some of the things we might associate with Cashmere in international branding. Very high price, of course. Warmth, captured in the invocation in the text here to embrace colder weather. The simple and understated design, luxury, fashion, and wealth, and possibly celebrity as well. This is from the luxury label established by Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen. So we don't generally think or see where Cashmere comes from or who produced it. On the other hand, this this luxury branding has been challenged in recent years, particularly over the past 5 years or so, by articles in both scientific and mainstream media, such as this article from the Wall Street Journal, which sounds the alarm about rangeland degradation and desertification in Mongolia. And in many of these, particularly in the popular press, many of these publications, herders are presented as destructive, reckless, driven by an uncontrolled desire to increase goat herds in order to satisfy global demand for Cashmere. This narrative of unsustainable overgrazing has been embraced by some parts of the international development community who've seen an opportunity to continue to sort of improve herders by building capacity for more intensive, more scientifically managed, and more coordinated livestock production and rangeland management. This image is a screenshot from a video published by the Sustainable Cashmere Project in Ummanlov, renamed more recently as the Gobi Cashmere Project, which is funded by Rio Tinto. And in this case, the herder is narrating the story at the point before the project experts kind of step in to help. He says, the size of our herds started to increase without limits, and you can sort of guess where this leads. But at the same time, Cashmere is the only one of Mongolia's top 50 export commodities that is actually based on a renewable resource. I think this is very significant as well, and it's a key, that makes it a key alternative to unsustainable extractive resource-based development. So this is yet another version of the same story, or a different telling of the story of Cashmere, which is less familiar to an international audience, but that is told kind of domestically here in Mongolia through the National Cashmere Program, the Industrialization 21-100 Program, the Mongolia Sustainable Development Strategy 2030, the Mongolia and Atsinhara 2050, the long-term strategy. These are all policy documents issued by the Parliament and Government of Mongolia. And in our own research and narrative, sort of trying to reimagine things in a similar way to the mead standard, we're also kind of driven by an interest in safeguarding what we call nomadic culture, pointing out that Cashmere supplies up to 80% of herders' cash incomes, thereby subsidizing a wide range of cultural practices, such as dairy production or interactions with sacred sites that are less economically viable, but important for a multitude of other reasons. So we had the Beyond Meat, and this is the Beyond Cashmere, I suppose. Let me see if I can allow recording here. Moving on. Oh, now I have to sort. Oh no, now we're lost. Okay, maybe somebody else can, if you can help me, I'll just continue reading. So we are, as researchers in our project here, we're drawn to Cashmere because it's so full of, also because it's full of apparent contradictions. It's exotic and local.
In progress.
Thank you. It's exotic and local, it's natural or organic and unsustainable, depending on who's telling the story. It's modern and traditional, it's a symbol of extreme wealth and extreme poverty, product of the material abundance of the urban consumer and the austerity of the nomad. So the starting point for our anthropological research then is a broad interest in a critique of mainstream development discourse, as reflected in the post-development ideas of scholars like Escobar and Rist and others, which appeal to the cultural relativist sense that there can be multiple, diverse and inclusive pathways to development. Cashmere also provides a strategic ethnographic point of engagement with globalized commodity chains, as well as an opportunity to investigate the real-world impacts of branding by thinking through the ways that the branding of cashmere as commodity simultaneously brands the herders who produce it. So this research also builds on our prior study of herders' efforts to make sense of internationally funded rangeland management initiatives, which have, in some cases, recently rebranded themselves as focusing on sustainable cashmere. So I mentioned we have this project that has recently kind of wound up as a pilot looking at sustainable cashmere, funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We've just released 5 Mongolian language reports through this research, which are available at the address I put here on the screen, as well as 3 open data sets managed in Zotero databases. So these documents present a discourse analysis of marketing and social media that mention sustainable cashmere, an analysis of cashmere sustainability standards and certifications, a statistical study, legislative and policy review, an extended literature review of Mongolian academic publications on cashmere, and our coded interviews with herders in 3 AMICs where distinct sustainable cashmere initiatives have been put in place. So Bayanhongre, Arkhanga, and Umunlov. So the baseline findings of this research confirm some of our initial hypotheses about messaging on cashmere and Mongolian herders. We observed a significant contrast between the ways that cashmere is represented internationally and in Mongolia. While most Mongolian language sources, and here I'm referring to our broader kind of literature review in Mongolia, while Mongolian language sources and authors associate cashmere with sustainable development, economic growth, and socioeconomic sovereignty, international scholarship and media sources bear much more negative ecological messaging, using alarmist language such as decimation or destruction, overgrazing, threat, irreversibility, and desertification. Yes? Well, okay. Okay. I'll calm down a little bit. Sorry. Yes. Okay. So just last week, a headline on CNN stated, and I'm quoting here, "Cashmere demand is threatening Mongolia's steppe. Can the industry go sustainable?" The answer, maybe, but we should think about pivoting to yaks. Whereas Mongolian sources suggest that cashmere is what keeps Mongolian nomadic culture viable, international authors tend to suggest the opposite, claiming that cashmere is essentially the end of nomadism. So in the first component of our research, we went through approximately 700 English language cashmere marketing resources, including online stores, YouTube videos, podcasts, blogs, and social media posts, where the term sustainable cashmere or some variation thereof was being explicitly used. In many cases, we didn't find any clear explanation at all for why the product was being described as sustainable. So this was most often the case on social media, particularly with ethical fashion influencers and retailers who simply took the word of manufacturers that the products they were promoting were sustainably made. Some retailers, in our analysis, had sustainability statements, which is a start, but they tended to be vague or difficult to assess objectively, such as claims that cashmere garments are sustainable because they're well made and meant to last. So I think there's some substance to it, but more or less a beginning. Among those who do make more specific claims, we found the idea of sustainability was being indexed to a wide range of different markers. These included the terms eco-friendly, ethical, wildlife-friendly, humane, or responsibly produced. So following on these findings, we analyzed a series of brand narratives presented by international designers and cashmere certification bodies. So although the substance of these stories differed, we found they all basically followed a Good Samaritan kind of salvation or savior frame. So I'll present a few examples of these. Again, these are international brands. Loro Piana might be familiar to many of us as a very high-level luxury brand. It's an Italian luxury menswear producer specializing in cashmere and wool garments. Shown here is a production still from a film by nature filmmaker Luc Jacquet, produced for L'Europeana, the label, that essentially depicts Inner Mongolian herders who source their cashmere as noble savages, victims to a global commodity chain that threatens the authenticity of their indigenous way of life, alongside the quality of their landscape and livestock. So the brand, in its own narrative about rescuing the Inner Mongolian herders, essentially saves the herders by introducing scientific conservation on the one hand, and secondly, on the other hand, a method that values small-scale production for the luxury market, so keeping very, very small, low-impact supply. A second example here is Nadam, a direct-to-consumer sustainable cashmere or self-branded sustainable cashmere startup launched by Wall Street broker Matt Scanlon through a Kickstarter campaign in 2014. Its brand narrative involves rescuing herders from an indentured relationship with middlemen or change, which ostensibly, according to their story, prevented herders from earning a fair price from cashmere and accumulating capital to invest in development. So what's interesting, and if not ironic, as we learned from our own field research where they were procuring their cashmere, Nadam actually set up its business with Utsibotjav, who is one of the most powerful chains in all of Mongolia. He's the owner, as you may know, of the Bojaz factory label, supplier of major global luxury brands, and the de facto leader of the Tsahan Yamat cooperative in Bayanlar, which has rebuilt the former Nikl on a privatized basis. So while Nadam takes credit for building a park and stadium in Bayanlar-Som, where we took the photo with Mijid, shown on the earlier slide, local herders have no knowledge of the American company, but widely praise Bojaz as a virtuous big man kind of figure. More on this later. Nadam, meanwhile, is now a very successful retailer of cheap cashmere, relying on conventional procurement channels. Designer Stella McCartney, the third international designer we're looking at, is looking at sustainability in very different terms. Sorry, this is not switching here. Very different terms. By shifting to recycled cashmere, having concluded that virgin cashmere is ecologically unsustainable. So the salvation in this particular case of herders and rangelands comes about by reducing demand, thereby encouraging reduced production and a focus on quality over quantity. So shifting to some of the certifications and standards and project initiatives, which I also kind of classify as branding initiatives. We've got here several in Mongolia. This is the Sustainable Cashmere Project, which I mentioned earlier, at another of our field sites, which was set up by Turquoise Hill Resources adjacent to the Oyo-Todra mine, through collaboration with luxury group Caring, the Wildlife Conservation Society, LUCS, Stanford University, and NASA. This initiative declares its intention to support the adoption of quote-unquote improved rangeland management and breeding practices in order to achieve sustainability and wildlife protection. So English language publications for an international audience about this project really champion the value of this initiative for rangelands and wildlife, but they have very little to say about herders themselves. A commissioned press article describes the project's international experts as, quote, coming to the rescue. It quotes several of the experts from participating observations, but not a single herder. Participating herders, meanwhile, appear to be relatively ambivalent about the project and its approach. We met with herders who've taken part in sustainable cashmere certification programs, of which there are two in Mongolia, operated by the Sustainable Fiber Alliance, SFA, and AVSF, and there's a third in Inner Mongolia, the Good Cashmere Standard, run by the Aid by Trade Foundation. These standards set out extensive series of technical criteria related to livestock production, monitored through a combination of herder self-assessments and external audits. So I'll get two screenshots showing very brief examples of those. This is from the SFA Animal Husbandry and Cashmere Fiber Harvesting Code of Practice, where we see a codification of some practices that are already part of traditional husbandry methods. Things like water troughs must be kept clean, fouled or stale feed must be removed, livestock enclosures should be made of natural materials such as wood, goats should be combed rather than shorn, and herders must have methods for managing orphan kids. Goats should be grazed on vegetation that provides a full diet. So at the same time, this branding markets certified sustainable cashmere as being produced through a modern logic of stability and control, essentially monitoring of herders, as opposed to the implicitly unsustainable practices of the unregulated nomad. The AVSF Sustainable Cashmere Certification, meanwhile, brands responsible herders as those who participate in a text-based regulatory regime, who position themselves as self-governing and legible subjects through self-reporting checklists and protocols, whose economic relations are made legible through institutionalized pasture user groups, or PUGs, in the place of private kin networks. And finally, we have two other brands in an effort to promote association with pure, higher quality cashmere. The Mongolian state has meanwhile registered 3 certification marks with the World Intellectual Property Organization. We've got pure Mongolian cashmere and made with Mongolian cashmere, which are intended for use on garments retail to the end consumer. Mongolian noble fiber at the bottom. The logo in Mongolian is the word marked with the word Han, Han Shidhukt. This is the result of an ADB-funded project implemented through the Mongolian Wool and Cashmere Association, ostensibly certifying that the product is made with 100% high-quality wool and cashmere sourced from Mongolia, that it meets Mongolian and international standards for textiles and woven products, and that it fully complies with quality standards in environmentally friendly manufacturing. But from the Mongolian side, as an economic and cultural sovereignty measure, this branding is also intended to capture broader claims to purity and authenticity, both of the product itself and of the Mongolian people and culture, tied to Mongolians' perceived mutualistic and co-evolved relationship with their livestock and the steppe. So as an example of this, in the bold words of former Minister of Food, Agriculture and Light Industry, Che Wozang, in introducing the subject trademark, Mongolia, I'm quoting here, Mongolia is one of the few countries that are engaged in livestock husbandry that ensures livestock animal welfare. So this branding comes quite a bit closer to many herders' own understanding of value, but it also mainly reflects downstream efforts to market an export commodity with high quality control from the perspective of furthering Mongolia's sovereign economic development. It asserts that Mongolian cashmere matches the industrial quality standards of more intensively produced and often cheaper Chinese products that have flooded global markets and arguably depressed cashmere prices. But it also brings vague assurances of thoroughbred heritage, and through the noble title, an indirect translation of the Mongolian version of Han, Chinggis Khan, noble fiber, which may be construed as an oblique contrast, perhaps, to the cinified and sedentarized settler colonial Inner Mongolia. To summarize, conventional luxury cashmere branding obscures the social origins of cashmere altogether as an exoticization practice, while international brands often present negative messages about Mongolian pastoral culture. So thinking in the context of counter-branding measures, we've been proposing that nomadic culture serves as a useful heuristic for a body of practices that establish connections to place, local knowledge, self-sufficiency, heritage, creative expressions, and aesthetics, including the tastes and smells and textures of the pastoral landscape, all of which objectively contribute to individual and community well-being and sustainability. So then let me look at 2 specific themes from our ethnographic interviews with herders that will hopefully help us to begin to rethink or reframe sustainability in the cashmere sector in relation to cultural factors. So first, we find that existing certifications assume that sustainability can be regulated at the herder level, but our dialogues with herders confirm that broader political economic factors can be more important determinants of sustainability. Sustainable cashmere certifications acknowledge that collective action or non-state governance institutions are necessary in order to achieve effective rangeland management. And on that basis, they may, as I've mentioned, require participation in herder user groups, or PUGs, as common pool resource management institutions. In the case of SFA, this approach is largely a continuation of prior development work to implement rangeland management collectivities based on the premises of commons theory. In practice, there are several challenges in implementing a commons theory-based model in Mongolia. Notably that decision-making in the pastoral economy isn't always guided by a logic of income maximization for the individual household as a bounded unit. We see frequent instances of keeping non-productive livestock, or in quotes, non-productive livestock, because they're held on behalf of extended family members who live in town, because they provide status and allow for culturally important activities such as dairy production or horse training, or because animals can roam with limited human intervention, accommodating fluctuating labor availability. The neoclassical economic model of cash income optimization, which predicts a preference for goat-dominated herds, is concretely challenged by relatively recent figures that admit an overall increase in livestock population, but also indicate a declining proportion of goats within overall herds over the past 15 years. In terms of larger scale factors affecting sustainability, herders frequently point to pricing. This is significant because sustainable Cashmere products and certifications assume that herders will be incentivized to promote quality over quantity, but this is predicated on a stability model where there are predictable outcomes that fails to align with a volatile and uncertain economy, and that is undermined by the lack of grade-based pricing in most places. As the first herder, so these are all quotes from herder interviews, as the first herder quote on the screen points out, it would be enough if prices could be stable. So we're asking about, what would a sustainable economy look like? It would be enough if prices could be stable, at least, without fluctuating. If there could be a set price for each year, herders would be happy. Otherwise, the price goes extremely high, then suddenly falls, which is tough. And our statistical research done in partnership with the National Statistics Office of Mongolia confirms considerable year-on-year average price volatility. These prices are in Tropics from 2007. They're not adjusted for inflation, but they do, I think, give a sense of the very extreme volatility, rising or falling by 50 to 80% of value, again, not even counting for inflation, from year to year. If we look on intra-year price volatility, we can see dramatic and unpredictable increases and decreases in Cashmere prices from 1 month to the next. In 2021, the price doubled from just under 60,000 togruks per kilogram to about 120,000 in March, declined to under 100,000 over the summer, fell precipitously in November to under 50,000, then rose back up again. So, and here's a zoomed in part of the 2021 graph. So there have been efforts in Mongolia to streamline Cashmere trade with the establishment of the Mongolian Agricultural Commodity Exchange in 2013. There have been price premiums to incentivize herder enrollment in cooperatives and pilot single-desk buyer systems in some zones. These interventions, unfortunately, have not created a future system with guaranteed floor prices for herders. They do not address pricing inequalities by region or by time in the season. An EDB single-desk pilot with Cashmere, for example, brought only a 2% improvement over the market price offered to herders and was judged a failure. Additionally, while the government of Mongolia has restricted exports of raw unwashed Cashmere, domestic commodity prices continue to be heavily influenced by global markets in which China plays a very large role. So herders point out that notwithstanding the self-improvement and self-education logic of sustainability certification initiatives, they actually have very minimal control over sustainability in the broader pastoral economy. As the herder quoted on the screen notes, in the past Mongolia used to use meat, wool, cashmere, hides, dairy, everything. But now the animal hides are worthless. They end up just discarded outside on the ground. So he's pointing, of course, to the fact that there's little economic value to the multiple and diverse products of the pastoral economy. Commons theory-based interventions are predicated on the view that resource user communities must have control over a bounded resource to ensure its sustainable use. Nonetheless, herders in interviews frequently raise concerns about larger scale, more powerful resource actors, notably mines, whose actions negatively impact the sustainability of herding. Roads, railways, transmission lines, serving mines transect the landscape, introducing risks of vehicle-livestock collisions, or covering entire valleys with dust, preventing grazing by livestock. While these forms of linear infrastructure do not necessarily occupy large amounts of overall space, their impact on mobility can be significant. Even at a distance from mines, herders complain of polluted water supplies, depleted aquifers, reduced precipitation due to cloud seeding allegedly undertaken to reduce dust at mine sites, livestock being startled by repeated explosions, as mentioned on the quote in the screen here, and desertification brought about by mines, and pointedly, again from the herder perspective, not by livestock. We didn't specifically ask about climate change in our interviews, but several herders in Munkhtamir, one of our field sites, brought it up, asserting that we don't have a real summer anymore. Herder observations are consistent with Mongolia's third national communication to the UNFCCC, which reports a decline in average annual precipitation of 7% over the period from 1940 to 2015, and an average temperature increase of over 2 degrees, but with more intensive precipitation in heat events and significant regional variation representing a high standard deviation in these outcomes. So these changes put Mongolia at a much higher risk than the global average of drought, vegetation loss, and extreme wintertime weather events, contributing to reduced grasslands' resilience to livestock grazing at current stocking levels, and the likelihood of biomass and biodiversity loss. From this perspective, outsider claims that herders themselves are decimating rangelands may be perceived as disingenuous. Some herder comments also reflect an ethics-based interpretation, as in the quote here. I think this climate change is due to livestock numbers, but it's also caused by people having a wrong relationship with nature. It's wrong that people cut down trees everywhere and dig up whatever they can find in the ground. We used to be able to live here, but we can't anymore. And similar themes are reflected in comments about the future of pastoralism and the role of the younger generation within it. On the one hand, several herders reported that their children were tightly integrated into the herding economy, notably coming to help with combing goats and doing similar work during weekends and school breaks. On the other hand, many herders also express ambivalence about the future in ways that indicate a sense that nomadic pastoralism as a way of life is becoming less and less sustainable. Income from Cashmere supported investments in university tuition and apartments in the city, supporting children's shift into urban life. So moving on to our second theme, we considered cross-cultural ethics, defining right and wrong practices in the global economy, and what does this mean for ethical Cashmere. Insofar as we're looking at market-based approaches to development and sustainability, we're not surprised to see expectations laid out for herders, in certifications particularly, that follow the virtue ethics of market capitalism. So basically, hard work, capital accumulation, material investments. The idea of investments comes up repeatedly as an explicit expectation of PUGs and cooperatives, and of course a focus on the material rather than on the spiritual world. Not to think about things necessarily too dichotomously, but from a cross-cultural perspective, we're also interested in thinking about how conceptions of ethics within Mongolian pastoral society and Mongolian virtue ethics in particular, which you heard about a little bit earlier from Espomacher and colleagues, how this idea of virtue and being a good person might contrast to some of the ethical frameworks that underpin existing sustainable Cashmere initiatives. So liberality in particular, the idea of Ugumurbayim, as a virtue, was repeatedly evoked by members of Budjab's cooperative in Bayanlov. I mentioned him as kind of the oligarch change. Universally praised both Budjab's accumulation of wealth as a very good thing, and his selfless redistribution of earnings within the community. This accumulation of wealth is, of course, ignored if we're thinking about virtue ethics in the Western sense. It's ignored in Aristotelian virtue ethics. In Weber's Protestant capitalist virtue ethics, wealth is associated with virtue if it comes about through ongoing hard work, thrift, and efficiency. In Mongolia, however, I would interpret wealth as exhibiting a strong semantic association of wealth, including livestock, with natural abundance and the inherent virtue of animals themselves. Madingboyan. So if we think about, from a semiotic perspective, we can consider that close to 4% of Mongolian place names actually include some variation of the word bayim, the Mongolian term for rich or plentiful. Bayim becomes part of compound terms like desert oasis, having a large and prosperous family, the sheep's uterus, a good autumn or a good year, having a secure and prosperous life. Alongside this, though, Mongolian ideas of wealth fit within a broader category of associations with abundance and pleasure as something that is positive, auspicious, and fundamentally natural. Virtue, in the context of Mongolian pastoralism, is captured also in this concept of boyung. We heard about hugging boyung earlier today, but deriving, of course, from the Buddhist philosophy of punya, Sanskrit meaning merit, an important element of Buddhist ethics when it refers to beneficial results, including happiness, that accrue through virtuous deeds and thoughts. But the three quotes that I put here on the screen very briefly kind of establish a connection between boyung and bayang, or wealth and virtue, abundance and merit. Thanks to the boyung of the animals, mating boyung, some people have been able to acquire apartments in the Ayamig, Sombor city. Thanks to the boyung of the cooperative, we were able to sell our cashmere at a nice high price this year. The old people used to call goats boyni armach, or maybe merit tether, or something along those lines, which is why we must continue to keep goats. Right? So this association of abundance and prosperity and goodness establishes also a connection to happiness and ethics in the pastoral setting. In a more literal religious sense, herders expressed boyung as connected with a spiritually inflected landscape, with monuments constructed to maintain visible ties with the ancestors and other than human inhabitants of the place. Prosperity, natural abundance, liberality, and good relations with the non-human world thus come across in some of our interviews as indicators of virtue and happiness that are inherent to nomadic culture. But even more strongly, some of our respondents, or research participants, suggested that herders were the sole bearers of virtue in Mongolia, with people in the city having turned their back on the land, their culture, and the good ways of living respectfully in the world. So, sustainability brands and certifications focus on social and environmental harm reduction, but Mongolian herder commentaries suggest that cultural sustainability, driven by a sense of living a virtual life, can also be taken as a central element of well-being. Globally, this is from the World Happiness Report, self-reported or subjective well-being is actually kind of at the median, 5.7 on a scale of 0 to 10. If any of you have done the Cantrell ladder scale, you'll know 0 represents the worst possible life in the universe, 10 is the best. Mongolia is sitting right there in the middle. So you're thinking about this in terms of what makes people happy, and how do people describe happiness and in connection with what? Well, quite often in the case of pastoral economy, happiness is directly tied to place. For example, the older woman from Bayanlov, quoted here on the slide, expresses a connection to place through her parents and ancestors, the sacred mountain that protects her and the children, and the happiness of being together with livestock. She says, "Of course I'm proud of my homeland. We have a nice homeland with gobi and grassland together. I'm proud of this fine bogged mountain. This here is my golden cradle where generations of ancestors have been buried. The one thing I take pride in is being able to give offerings of milk for the protection of my children. As I get older, it's nice for an old person to be able to look after a few animals like this. No matter how many songs and festivals and games come by, really there's nothing as nice as being able to go along watching after the animals. As your eyes get worse and your ears get a bit deaf, that's what it's like." So others spoke of well-being in terms of the natural environment, mentioning that happiness was seeing the vegetation in the desert after the rain, or the combination of mountains and rivers in the Hangab. And finally, we see a connection between happiness, culture, and sustainability in comments on the material archaeological heritage of the landscape. The herder quoted here comments that they're happy to live alongside cultural monuments from the past, suggesting that they're inspired by this heritage, but also consider themselves as stewards of these diverse monuments that date back to the Bronze Age and that have remained intact due to the low impact nature of nomadic pastoralism to this day. So, what does all this tell us about nomadic culture and sustainability? Well, I've been, throughout this presentation, alluding to three major problems. First, the voices of Cashmere suppliers, i.e. Mongolian herders, are effectively absent in the messaging that reaches consumers overseas, kind of the starting point of our research. Second, measures of Cashmere sustainability are typically technical ones, but these measures are framed by broader stories or narratives of blame, salvation, or improvement through Protestant ethics. And third, there's no discussion of cultural value in efforts to describe sustainability in the Cashmere sector or in pastoralism more generally. International organizations tend to have a fairly narrow view of what development means. I hope that this won't be disputed. Mainly poverty reduction through economic growth, for the most part, which usually ignores the cultural factors that actually give meaning to our lives. So in this sense, We need to stand with those who've called for culture to be recognized as a fourth pillar of sustainability, alongside environmental, social, and economic sustainability. Our field research indicates that herders themselves often identify cultural sustainability with issues of culture change and perceived culture loss, such as the widespread abandonment of ox carts in the Hungai region in recent years in favor of trucks for moving the yurt and livestock between camps. We see ox cart technology listed among the properties on Mongolia's national list of intangible cultural heritage. It's here in the bottom row, second from the left. But we also see a wide range of other practices that are still extremely vibrant and deeply rooted in what I've been calling nomadic culture. So some of these are relatively new, perhaps invented traditions, if we want to call them that. Things like camel races and camel polo. Some, like felt art and embroidery, are flourishing, albeit in commodified form. But these elements are arguably unrelated to the goals to goats in Cashmere. However, none of them could really survive as living traditions without nomadic livestock production as a holistic system. So I mentioned the idea of counter-branding earlier as suggesting itself in this context as a potential strategy for self-representation and the assertion of cultural value within and alongside market channels, not only by small-scale Cashmere labels, but also by communities, NGOs, governments, and other collectivities. We're promoting this list of nomadic cultural practices as a set of indicators of cultural vibrancy and sustainability, and as a component of a planned Nomad-Friendly, culturally sustainable branding or certification initiative that we're hoping to get going over the coming year. To amplify an earlier point, Cashmere Income effectively subsidizes a wide range of other culturally significant but less economically valuable practices, such as horse training or dairy processing, or just living as mobile pastoralists in the countryside, and for that matter, anything on the intangible cultural heritage list, which create various forms of well-being and promote cultural survival along nomadic herders. So standards making implies that terms and commitments can and should be defined by experts in many cases, or at least they've been interpreted as such, as a resolution to technical problems. This is an approach that has been widely critiqued by anthropologists, since the normative weight given to expert knowledge often disempowers those whose struggles are of a more political nature. The broader social context reveals that the actual ethical or sustainability challenges in this case are not really technical at all, but political, ethical, and cultural, and at a broader scale than the individual herder, household, or community. So that's the end of the presentation. I hope our work will support and inspire efforts to find new ways of thinking about ethics and sustainability in global commodity chains. Thanks for your attention. Sorry for running over time, and welcome to comments and suggestions.